Now let's turn to Saadia Zahidi. She's the managing director at the New Economy and Society at the World Economic Forum. She's also the author of 50 Million Rising, about women entering the workforce in the Muslim world. Saadia?
Hi, Ron.
Hey, there you are. Hey, good morning, or good afternoon. So, we're kind of marching through. We started with K to 12, and we took our audience into young adults and learners in post-secondary. But now we're in the workplace with you, and obviously this is a huge impact across the workforce, really in almost every country in the world, but very different impacts for different kind of workers. You briskly summarized the differences in a recent piece. Can you start by talking about the ways this has changed things for different classes or groups of workers?
Sure. First off, let me try to offer a bit of a sort of global perspective, right?
Yeah.
There's just over 3 billion people in the world's adult workforce. Of them, 81% are affected by a partial or complete lockdown. That is,
Wow.
Basically the vast majority of working adults around the world. And the ILO predicts that about half of them are at risk of permanently losing their livelihoods. And so I think that's the magnitude of the shift and the change and the challenge that we're talking about here. Of course, it depends very much on how we manage the sequencing of the health and the economic response.
Can I jump in real quick there and ask you, just
Sure,
a sense of that magnitude? Do we have any idea how that compares to the Depression in the 1930s? Is this a bigger global impact and disruption of working?
So I think in terms of workers, there isn't good enough data, but
Okay.
I think if you compare the size of the economic losses at that time and this time, a lot of economists are predicting that it's going to be of an equivalent, if not worse, magnitude, especially if you look at the US economy and for where we do have somewhat comparable data. Now, in terms of what this means specifically for different workers, I think overall what it means is that all of the speculation that we've been having about, the future of work has actually arrived for most workers. One, for the white collar workforce, we're talking about remote work actually now being a reality. And it happened very quickly after many years of sort of a hesitation to put that in place. It's actually happened very, very quickly. And by and large, for a fairly well-skilled white collar workforce, it's tending to work. The second element is for a lot of service workers and for a lot of blue collar workers, this is actually a very worrying glimpse into a future in which machines do displace people in some form or the other, because the predictions from everybody right now is we are likely to see an acceleration of the automation and digitalization of the workplace. And there's a number of reasons why that's going to get accelerated given everything that we've just seen with the current health crisis. The third element is for those that are in the care economy and the health sector and the education sector, as we've just discussed with the other two speakers, this has led to this long overdue revaluation of the work that those people do. And that is an important element, and I think can be turned into an opportunity to create a little bit of upward wage pressure, improve the quality in those roles, really think about revaluing those roles. And then finally, fourth, for this sort of informal and kind of gig economy, I think it's exposed the fundamental lack of social protection that has been eroded away in most advanced economies in particular and didn't exist to begin with in a lot of developing economies. That has just become extremely clear to everybody.
You used the phrase in your piece that that I kind of started with, which is there is an opportunity to build back better, not just kind of restore the status quo ante of where we were. Maybe thinking about those different tranches of workers that you laid out, what are some of the most important ways we could build back better? And is that going to be possible at a moment when economies and governments are still going to be, reeling and potentially underfunded for quite some time?
So I think there is this moment of huge influx of funding currently going in, a lot of extraordinary fiscal policy measures that are being put in place to either get funding directly to specific workers or to households or to specific SMEs or major industries, and essentially try to maintain the link between workers and employers. And that's basically what a lot of these efforts are dedicated towards. As a second wave of support and stimulus needs to go into these measures, there's an opportunity to either build in some conditionalities or really invest truly in some of the specific areas that can help build back better. And I'll just give like a very quick overview of sort of the few points that we're thinking are the right way to do that. One, doubling down on the upskilling and reskilling. And I think your previous two speakers have said that that is a given. But for most economies, even some of the most advanced economies, you know, the Nordics, the Scandinavian countries, a lot of European economies that have tended to still support this agenda, the systems are not in place to do that at scale. And that's what we're going to need to address. The second element is, sorry, go ahead.
No, go finish. Second element.
The second element is sort of identifying the jobs of tomorrow. We put out a piece in January at our annual meeting in Davos that was very focused on what might those jobs of tomorrow look like. And, you know, we predicted that it's sort of the care professions, it's a lot of focus on technology, it's really specialized sales, and obviously it's the green economy. I think largely those four elements still stand, but there's going to be new opportunities within those. There's going to be a slight sort of changes, perhaps longer term structural shifts in a lot of economies, but still focusing on those areas will make a lot of sense, and helping workers understand what those are is going to be critical. Prioritizing redeployment and reemployment. Now, again, in a lot of economies, the structures that help people do either the short-term rapid redeployment or the longer-term support through active labor market policies, in a lot of economies, that system has just eroded away, and that needs to be rebuilt. And then, of course, there's, you know, let's revalue the essential work that has just suddenly been exposed to all of us as being critical to how our economies and societies function. We're going to have to revalue that. And I don't see a system where we go back and suddenly start devaluing the work of those workers again.
I want to come back to that in a moment, but let me ask you, Andrew Chen a question. Do you expect the wealth gap to increase or decrease post-recovery? And if increase, how could we avoid that?
I think it depends very much on what kinds of conditionalities and systems governments are putting in place right now. If for some economies, is a very deliberate effort going on. For example, in Denmark, you know, support is not going to companies that use tax havens, or at least tax havens outside of outside of Europe. France is following something similar. There's a lot of conditionalities in place, including in the US, which are giving support to companies on the condition that they will not be doing any significant layoffs in the near future. So I think it depends very much on governments to shape what kind of post-pandemic recovery and economy we want. And of course, there are other parts of the world where this is highlighting the inequalities, where support and loans are going to larger companies, not necessarily going to the smaller ones, where the effort required in applying for that support is so large that most small companies cannot afford it. So I think it depends on how easy and agile we make this system. But that said, I think it's not just about those conditionalities, right? Here's this opportunity that none of us were expecting to build back a different kind of economy. And that means investing more in the green economy, investing more in certain parts of the workforce that have been underinvested, but we now know care, healthcare, education, all of this matters and is a huge employer of people. So I think there are ways to correct those inequalities if we are proactive in those investments and if we build in the right kind of conditionalities in the short term. You know,
you've mentioned several times the point, as I phrase it, that the workers that we've seen to be the most essential in these economies have been treated as the most disposable before this, with very low benefits, very low compensation, low benefits, little job security. Are you optimistic that this wrenching experience really all across the globe and the way we are relying on some of these low paid, workforces will change the debate about what is the floor of security and compensation that every worker deserves? Do you think that is going to happen, or what would be required for that debate to change?
I think that is what we need to all come together to make happen. And that is what a number of international organizations are calling for. And that is absolutely the right way to go, because you've seen an erosion of that basic social protection floor in a number of developed economies. And you're basically seeing a situation where that floor was not created to begin with in a lot of developing economies. And the sense was, we're going to use the sort of manufacturing-based development model, and that's going to eventually lift all boats for everybody. Neither of those things can continue the way we've been imagining them to be. So we have to put in place something more proactive. But I think it's not simply a matter of, there has to be a lot of government support provided into that, but there are also commercial or semi-commercial solutions that can help deliver that kind of support, whether it's on education, on healthcare, but it requires sort of building that in a way that doesn't end up creating greater inequality.
Question from several people, Vasuki, Jack, different versions of it. Do we need, and do you see us moving toward, in the US and elsewhere, a universal basic income as a way of getting through this and getting through the prospect that employment will remain depressed and suppressed for some time? Is that an idea, Andrew Yang, if you're listening, that has come?
I think to some extent, we have ended up providing a form of temporary universal basic income to many, many parts of the workforce, or a promise of temporary universal basic income in many parts of the workforce in advanced economies. I think what we're likely to see a greater pressure towards is more universal basic services. And there's a sort of waking up and recognition that, for example, in the United Kingdom, if there has been a depletion of the support for the NHS, there's now a sort of resurgence of support for that kind of model. It's similar, broadly speaking, in Europe, a lot of support for having, or rather a view that we've been doing the right thing by providing basic healthcare services, and we need to double down on that, and this crisis has proven that. So I think there's a few other areas where the sort of essential nature of some of these services has become even more visible, and that's what we're likely to double down on, I think, as opposed to simply universal basic income.
Well, Saadia, Zahidi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this morning. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.